Before we start, I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay our respects to elders past, present and future. We would also like to acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with us or watching today. So before we begin, I'd like to introduce myself as the moderator for tonight. My name is Calvin. I'm currently a UTS student studying a Bachelor of Communications, majoring in Public Communication and a Bachelor of Creative Intelligence and Innovation. I'm also working as an internal communication specialist at Woolworths Group. Outside of that, I am also a Sydney Youth Advisory Counsellor. So a bit different from what I currently do as a student and as an employee. But I think that stemmed from my experience going on student exchange to Virginia Tech in the second half of 2019. So luckily just before COVID. And from there, my interest in American affairs really blossomed. And so seeing this opportunity with the US Consulate for the Sydney Youth Advisory Council, I put in an application, didn't think I was going to get in, but here I am. So that is a little bit about me. And giving the background to this webinar, to celebrate Black History Month, we'll be joined by author Cole Brown and our colleague Trevor Moss, NCIS Special Agent, as they discuss their lived experience and the shared experience of all African Americans and how these experiences have shaped and strengthened America. And I'd like to do a special call out to the Ben Franklin Club, which is hosted by the US Consulate. The Ben Franklin Club is a youth networking group for students and young people interested in US politics and affairs, and it is supported by the US Consulate General of Sydney. At the end of the webinar, you're going to be receiving a link if you're interested in signing up, and it's a great way to keep up to date with future events with the US Consulate and other events. In terms of housekeeping, everyone is automatically put on mute, and we will first go through some pre-submitted questions by the audience before turning over to you to ask questions live. Think of it as like a chat, and I'm just here to moderate and ask questions either on your behalf through typing, or if you'd like to speak yourself, just raise a hand and we can call on you to have a chat. And before we start, I'd like to pass over to Elizabeth Power, who is the Acting Consul General, to say a couple of words before we start.
Thanks so much, Calvin, and thanks to everybody who's joining us. Big thanks in particular to Trevor and Cole, to our panelists. We're really looking forward to what you have to say. I don't know if everybody knows that National Black History Month grew out of an effort in 1926 by US historian Carter Woodson. He created Negro History Week in that year. And that is the origin of Black History Month, which we now celebrate every year in the United States. And it's our formal recognition and celebration of the many contributions made by Black Americans to the United States. It's an acknowledgement that Black history is American history, that Black culture is American culture, and that our country has been profoundly shaped and continues to be profoundly shaped by Black American contributions. If you look back to the very beginnings of the United States, thousands of African-American soldiers fought in our war for independence. Many of our national landmarks, including the White House, the US Capitol, many other buildings were built by the labor of Black slaves. And if you look back from our beginnings to present day, you see scientists and inventors responsible for a wealth of American innovation. You see countless Americans who have fought for justice and equality and peace and security in the United States and around the world on behalf of the United States. People who are teaching the next generation, representing their community in politics and other organizations, creating some of America's greatest art and literature and music, and really sharing all of that with the world. It might be more appropriate to call Black History Month Black Living History Month. You know, we're talking about an ongoing, lived, shared experience of what it means to be African American in the United States, and how these contributions have shaped and strengthened our country over the years and continue to do so. It's especially fitting for us to be having this conversation this year in the wake of the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many others, and the very public wrestling that has gone on in the United States over our identity and how we understand our history of where we come from and our future of where we want to go. It's also a year that has seen our most racially diverse Congress, and a year in which we've elected the first Black American vice president. So with all of these different pieces of the puzzle in mind, we know that you all are paying attention to this as much as we are. We know that we still have a lot of work to do. And so in that spirit of rolling up our sleeves and getting to work, I'd like to hand it back over to Calvin and Trevor and Cole to start the discussion. And thank everybody once again for joining us.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I'd like to introduce the panelists. So raised in the city of brotherly love and sisterly affection, Cole Brown is a Philly kid at heart. While spending childhood summers between Ethiopia and the Midwest, Cole matured in Philadelphia's predominantly white private schools and neighborhoods, an experience that delivered an awareness of race and class from a young age. After graduating high school, Cole moved to Washington, D.C. to attend Georgetown University as a finance major. Landmark events such as the death of Michael Brown and the election of Donald Trump caused Cole to rethink his original plans. Cole graduated from Georgetown with a major in justice and peace studies and a passion for storytelling. During his time at Georgetown, Cole was inspired to begin penning his first book, Grey Boy, Finding Blackness in a White World, which very recently was nominated for NAACP Image Awards Outstanding Literary Award in the category for debut author. So congratulations, Cole. Grey Boy is a collection of introspective essays that follows the journey of Black identity when subsumed in an environment of white privilege. And I'd also like to introduce Trevor Moss. NCIS Special Agent Trevor Moss enlisted in the US Navy in 1991 and was commissioned in the United States Marine Corps in 1996, serving deployments to Africa, Central Asia, and the Middle East. Special Agent Moss joined the NCIS in 2004 and has served in Yokosuka, Japan, New Orleans, Louisiana, in Iraq as that's a bit of a mouthful here, in Iraq as the Task Force Counterintelligence Coordinating Authority for the Combined Joint Special Operations Task Force, Iraq, and in Hawaii and Thailand. Special Agent Moss currently serves as the resident agent in charge in Australia, is a New Carrollton, Maryland native, and received his Bachelor of Science degree from Norfolk State University. So without further ado, let's have a chat. So perhaps the first question to ask is, what does Black History Month mean to you? And I might pass it over to Cole Brown to start off. Oh, whoops, sorry, Cole. Are you just able to unmute? Yep, okay. There you go.
We're good now. Right. Sorry about that. You would think at this point I know how to work at Zoom. Thank you for having me. Before we jump in, I really appreciate it. It's always a pleasure to be with the Consulate General. What does Black History Month mean to me? I think that that was a phenomenal introduction that we received from Elizabeth in terms of what Black History Month is. I think that she hit on a couple of key points. The one that is most central in my mind is that Black history is American history. You mentioned in my introduction that I grew up in sort of a white private schooling system, and for that reason was not often taught that so much of American history was shaped by the contributions of Black people from the time of slavery, where much of American wealth finds its roots, up until present day in so many important ways. So Black History Month to me, hopefully, is one of 12 months where I acknowledge the fact that we did a lot to shape that nation, but one where it is done so more openly and with greater intention.
Thank you, Cole. Trevor, keen to hear your thoughts. What does Black History Month mean to you?
Let's see, shift control. Sorry, give me just a second. Okay, can you hear me now?
Can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, perfect. I'm just a little touch new to this. First, I would like to say thanks for the invitation to this forum. It's I always welcome opportunities to exchange ideas, share experiences. It's a great way to increase awareness and just learn. So that way we can be better members of our society and help others. So this is a great forum and very appreciative to share the floor with all these wonderful people. To your question, Black History Month has always been very special to me because at a young age, it wasn't always recognized, and found out early in my life that there are significant contributions to the United States from the African American community. And so when you have something like Black History Month that gives an opportunity to actually share and help teach and explain that there is more to the life and the history of African Americans besides just slavery. There were significant contributions in science, medicine, politics, what have you. And it's a chance for folks to pause and reflect, and to also just I ultimately what I think Carter G. Woodson's goals were is to help break down some of the stereotypes that tend to drive people's perceptions of us when they see us.
Thank you very much. Is being African American expressed in a universal way, or are there regional and/or demographic variants? Trevor?
Yeah, sure. I don't think there's any one particular expression of being an African American, whether you're in the United States or abroad. Pretty much like anyone else in the world. Your geography and the environment around you largely shapes how you act and react. To that end, I will say, as an African American, there are places where you tend to be perceived in a certain way. There are stereotypes that unfortunately some have actually proliferated through regular mass media, social media, or what have you. So to that end, there does there's sometimes a bit of a uniform reaction to how people see you, and then you just have to figure out how you're actually going to conduct yourself in the face of some of those perceptions. But I don't think there's any one way per se to actually be an African American. You just have to live your truth as a human being, and just do what's best suited for you in your life.
Thank you. Cole, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that African American as a term is a term that's, I don't know, maybe 50 years old. Actually less than that. Black as an identity is one that's probably 2 centuries old in terms of a homogenous group that is Africans that are now in America. My point in saying that is only that this identity is constructed. That you take a heterogeneous group of people and put them in a place and give them a name. So of course we're very different. I think that the confusion only ever comes from the sense that is not often communicated, that we're very different. There's often perhaps a monolithic understanding more broadly about what Blackness is. Speaking specifically to media, Blackness is often portrayed in certain very slender categories. But we are, of course, a very varied group. I express Blackness, I'm sure, much different than Trevor would and anyone else. So yeah, we're different.
Thank you. And how have your experiences as African Americans differed in the US versus abroad? And obviously, as you guys are in Australia, I'm sure you may be able to tell the differences. So yeah, how have your experiences been, Cole?
Yeah, so I'm new. We're probably the most people on the call. I'm coming up on my 1-year mark. I got here in February, just a couple of weeks before lockdown. So it was a difficult time, I think, to be an African American anywhere in the world. I think that it was a difficult several months there following the death of George Floyd. particularly to been African American abroad. I think that there was real pain, real hurt that was clear in those protests. And it was difficult. It was difficult to watch that and not to be there, showing support in the way that I wish I would have been able to. Divorced from, like the immediate context, I also think being an African American in Australia in particular, I mean, Australia is just an incredibly white place. And I was here, I hadn't really been here for any significant amount of time before moving here. And I have been surprised by the things that I took for granted back home that were part of my culture that are just nowhere to be found here. The music, the food, some interactions that can only be had between people of the same tribe. I haven't done much of that in the last year. So a lot of that I miss as well.
And Trevor?
Yeah, I would say there, in a number of ways, there's some pretty stark differences when you look at, in terms of just outright racial aggression, or what I would also, what's also considered microaggressions. So a microaggression is just like little subtle things that people do that, remind you of, that you have a different skin tone, and it's in a bit of an uncomfortable manner. Whereas, of course, outright aggression. It's unfortunate. Although my country has made significant progress, it's unfortunate I've probably experienced more, of those outright incidents at home. I remember being a little kid, moving to a new neighborhood, and one of my neighbors would tell me I can't play with their kid because I'm Black. I remember riding in a car with one of my friends in high school. He was driving too fast. I was a passenger, and the police stopped him, but I was the one that got pulled out of the car and taken downtown. Even though the white kid that was speeding, was the one operating the vehicle. Over here, I've only been here for a couple of months, but so not too many experiences here. A few, but not too many. But throughout my travels around the world, you see that people, sometimes they interpret you differently because there are times when you're probably the first person that look like you do, or that looks like I do, that they didn't see on a television or some type of poster or something. So it's almost unusual or like interesting to them that they're seeing like someone like this, like, oh my God, this is real. Like, I've had people, there was a time I did have hair on my head, when they would ask me like, why does your hair grow like that? They rub my skin to see if the color would change, or things like that. And they just really were just curious and didn't understand. And then, but I would just consider that just, ethnic curiosity doesn't bother me. Glad to talk, glad to share. But then there are folks where they kind of maybe take it up another step, and they'll start to make comments where you start to feel unwelcome, and they behave in a manner where you feel unwelcome. And that does tend to follow wherever you are in the world. But like I said, outside the US, microaggressions are there. Inside the US, especially in certain areas, it's still, a bit uneasy. One of the things I had to explain to one of my friends when I was in Louisiana, after there was a high profile, officer involved killing of a unarmed Black man, was I said, when I'm driving down the street and I see those blue lights behind me, the first thought I have is I just hope I can make it home. Whereas they may think, okay, maybe, I just got caught speeding, so there are different perceptions and attitudes. Now, having said all that, I would like to add, even though, the US, isn't, perfect, as no country is, I also do like to highlight that America has made, significant strides and progress. And that's why, I dedicate myself and my professions, the way that I have, because I see that, through participation and inclusion, you can actually help shift some of those perspectives and stereotypes about you. You can help people understand that there's more to your history, and that you can't treat everyone, as if they're a certain monolith, and that, we can contribute and make things better. And I apologize if I rambled a little bit.
No, ramblings are more than welcome. Always love to hear your thoughts, Cole, what are your thoughts on those? Yeah, I guess Trevor's experiences with,
Yeah.
I guess, or microaggression with the blatant racism. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm keen to hear from you.
Yeah, I would totally plus one what Trevor just said. Again, I'm not speaking about Australia specifically, because like I have, for instance, a lot of family. I think you mentioned this in my bio. I have a lot of family in Ethiopia, for instance, and that too is outside of the U.S. That's a very different experience. But here in Australia, I totally agree that the blatant sort of in your face aggression and racism that I did at times face, both when I was young, but then also even to present day, I haven't really sensed it all here. There's an uneasiness when you're I mean, I grew up in Philly. I grew up in an urban environment, and there's an uneasiness, particularly when cops are around, that has been difficult for me to shake. I'll never forget. I was just maybe 2 months ago. I was here in Bondi, down on sort of a grassy knoll, having dinner with a friend, and I guess some kids were lighting fireworks on the beach, and I heard that first firework. And I like grabbed my friend, hopped up, like I was like, "We gotta go." And she was like, "Cole, what are you doing? Like, that's not a thing here. We don't have guns. It's okay. Sit down." So I think that there are cultural things that become ingrained in you. There's a nervousness that I feel around cops that I have had to check, that I didn't even realize I had to this extent. It has been refreshing to be here during that time for that reason. But knowing that I'm going to go back, I also don't want to really lose all of that, because I think that it's necessary to survive in that country at times.
And that links to one of the questions that somebody submitted. And I know no one has the final definitive solutions to this problem, but perhaps in what you might think, what do you see might be the most informative parameters of progress against racism? Bit of a big question there, but what are your thoughts?
That is a big question. I think that that's a difficult thing to measure. I mean, I think that there's probably a policy element. I mean, we're certainly seeing that with the new administration that's come in, that is prioritizing, at least is said to be prioritizing elements around, with approaching climate in a way that is racially equitable, approaching policing in a way that is racially equitable. So I think that there's probably a policy component there. But I think the more difficult thing to measure is just like what Trevor was talking about, like the woman that clutches her purse kind of thing. That those microaggressions, at times macroaggressions, those I think those are less tangible, and yet I remember them well, and they really shaped the person that I've become and my understanding of my country and my own personhood. Those attitudes, I think, are progress is made through re-education, and also diversification of spaces. I mean, I grew up in very segregated spaces, and I think that leads to ignorance. I've seen less of that. I've seen less of the progress on that end than I have perhaps the small window for hope we have at the moment on the policy end.
Right, and Trevor?
Yes, I would just to follow up on a point that Cole made. It's because again, that is a large issue, but some of the better ways I think that would help address these issues are education is key, as far as just people just understanding history, relevance, contributions, but then also I would add to that access to opportunities, because it's even though you hear a lot about police brutality and socially economic depressed communities, that's just one facet of the total picture. Like when you look at the larger scope of things, like say something like the Fair Housing Act, I'm getting close to 50, and I was just shy of being born into Jim Crow, or before they had a Fair Housing Act. But when you think about something like that, the Fair Housing Act, basically known as redlining in the US, that determined where people lived. And if you were a Black person you weren't allowed to live in certain areas, and where you live dictates where you can go to school, and your education dictates your job, and so on down the line. So we're starting to finally turn the corner on some of those things, with people just being able to have just more access to opportunities, as well as just having more awareness of who they are and what they can achieve. Just and a large part of that's just visualization. If you grow up in a certain type of neighborhood, what you see around you starts to become how you perceive yourself. If you're a young child and you watch the news and you see these armored vehicles in Iraq and they're talking about fighting the terrorists, and then you look out your window and you see the same vehicle police in your neighborhood, you start to wonder, what it is about yourself or what's actually going on. So yeah, again, there are a lot of parts to that, but I will say, I don't know if there's any certain parameter that or metric that could be used, but there are sometimes small signs that you see that make you think, okay, things actually are getting better, at least in certain respects. Like, for instance, during the inauguration, I actually was one of those nerds that got up early in the morning to watch the entire thing. And I thought it was great to see Kamala Harris get sworn in as vice president. And one of the things that I thought was interesting, especially in my span of life, is that most of the comments were about her being the first, African American, Southeast Asian American, and woman nominated that office. But what they weren't saying was, look at that African American woman with that white male. So we have at least made, some progress in that end, where certain things should be normalized, and they are getting that way, because at the end of the day, we're all people. We're probably indistinguishable at a cellular level. We're people that can contribute and do any number of things. So we just have to keep pushing that direction. But like I said, as far as indicators, parameters, a little tricky to determine. But if we keep going, especially along the lines of access to opportunities, education, we'll see that arc bend more and more towards where it needs to be, for equality.
Thanks.
That's it.
And I guess, sorry. Did you have anything else?
Oh no, I was just saying that's it.
Oh, no, you're right. Yeah, I guess a large part of it does come down to, I guess, the policies and the structure, that's kind of set by the government. So leading on to the next question, what do you anticipate will change in the lives of experiences of Black people under a Biden-Harris administration?
Trevor, do you want to go first, or I can?
Yeah, sure. I'll just go in there for starters. Like one thing is just to understand, it's like it is certainly refreshing to see this administration come in with some of the changes they've made with the diversity and inclusion. It's very refreshing to see. But myself, and I don't think really too many other folks have any misconception that in 4 years everything is going to be righted. It's these problems have been with our country for hundreds of years now. There's been significant events, Emancipation Proclamation, voting rights for women in the 1920s, voting rights for African Americans in the 1960s. So there are those major points, those major shifts, but it's I don't think it's fair to think, or even realistic to think, in 4 years the course is going to be righted. It's going to probably get better on track. One of the things that was popular during President Obama's tenure, and that possibly maybe brought back under a Biden-Harris administration, would be consent decrees. Because again, going back to policing, not the end-all be-all, but just one of the more obvious issues and one of the more talked about issues these days. Consent decrees were when the federal government was actually allowed to see, like, what are some of these local police departments and stations doing, that may show some type of just either implicit bias or just outright bias, against certain individuals. For instance, I'm from Maryland, so one of the things I've read up on were the Baltimore Police Department, where you would see a form filler where they would have the subject already identified as African American male, and that was just filled out on the forms. So it's hard to imagine that doesn't create some type of bias. And then if you look at the death of Philando Castillo, the gentleman that was shot by the police while his hands were on the wheel and he was in lawful possession of a weapon in front of his girlfriend and that small child. If you look at his law enforcement history, he had 52 stops prior to him actually being killed that day by the police, but 0 arrests. So that's exceptionally indicative of him being profiled, in the worst way consistently. And you hopefully, again, going back to, the Biden-Harris administration, they'll do something, if not the consent decrees, things along those lines, to help try to get things back to where they should be and maybe even start to move that needle again more in the direction of right. And I think you can also, again, see signs of it with just the diversity of, his administration, that he's very much interested in making the administration reflect, American society and go forward with those ideas.
Thanks. Sorry, before we hear your thoughts, Cole, if I just pass over to the attendees. If you would like to ask a question, feel free to pop it into the chat or raise a hand to speak. As we hear Cole's thoughts on the topic, that should give plenty of time if you want to ask a few questions. So sorry, Cole, for interrupting. Just thought quickly slip that one in.
Yeah, happy to get people involved. I have a few thoughts on that. So the question was, what will change with this administration? I think the first obvious answer is just the rhetoric, just the way that we're approaching Black people in America, particularly in the waning months of the Trump presidency. You saw so much law and order rhetoric, so much, in my opinion, just demonization of Black men in particular, from a president that had a long history of that sort of behavior and rhetoric, extending well beyond his time as president. So that's one obvious place. Going from that to a president who has openly identified issues, systemic issues with policing, a vice president who is herself Black, that's a major shift. I think there's also, as we were talking about earlier, policy things that will change. Voting rights is a major issue. If we'll get another major voting rights bill passed, again, there's a large question of what is possible with the Senate currently, but a voting rights act would be huge. Biden and the Biden administration has indicated that relief with COVID will sort of disproportionately impact minority communities that have been disproportionately impacted by COVID. Similarly with their climate actions, he has said, will disproportionately impact minority communities that disproportionately bear the brunt of climate. So I think that there is hope, there is cause for hope in a lot of these areas. It's still early. He has not made good on any of these promises. It's too early to have expected him to, but I think that there is cause for hope. That said, even in his early days, what you're seeing is an undoing of a lot of the actions that Trump did. So there's a question of how much are we sort of undoing recent wrongs versus how much are we actually moving the goalpost forward. So that's all that. But then I had one more point that I thought, that at least when I thought of it, I thought was an important one. Oh, I have it now. Trevor, I think Trevor made an incredibly important point that I want to go back to. And I think it's fitting in the time of Black History Month. Trevor mentioned redlining and Fair Housing Act. And that's the issue. That is why one cannot expect a Biden presidency to be the antidote. Because I think that America and Americans refuse to confront the ways in which it has really been impossible for Black Americans to advance in that nation. For people that are not familiar with redlining, a very high percentage of familial wealth in America is tied up in one's home. It was impossible for entire generations for Black people to buy homes that would appreciate in value. So when you look at drastic wealth gaps in America, that can't be corrected in 4 years or even probably in a single generation. That's when you're looking at significant disparities. That's the history we're talking about that has prevented Black people from being sort of at a level playing field. I think many Americans, and the reason that Black History Month is so necessary is many Americans don't even understand that history. Want to say we should pick ourselves up by our bootstraps, and don't understand the ways in which, again, systemically, it has been impossible to do so since the founding of the nation.
Very insightful. Definitely, yeah, something that I guess us as Australians might not be as aware of that history. So it's really, really insightful to hear. One question that someone has asked in the chat, does it make a difference that President Biden uses the term systemic racism?
I'll answer it first. I think yes. I mean, I think rhetoric matters. I think that there was a question during the Trump presidency. I particularly remember this when Trump was running. That was around like, does rhetoric matter versus action, as though it was either or. Like that, you heard that question a lot, like on cable news, like, oh, his rhetoric doesn't matter because he acts this way, or vice versa. Which I think was just like a stupid dichotomy to create. I mean, it was just invented. I think both matter. I think what comes out of the president's mouth matters, as does what he does. Yes, I think it matters that he's calling racism systemic. Now, obviously, the thing that must then follow, though, is a correction of those systemically racist policies. So I'm encouraged by the rhetoric we've seen thus far, but now one must see action for that rhetoric to be meaningful.
Trevor, keen to hear your thoughts.
Yes, I absolutely agree with Cole. It's the language does matter. Words do matter. Those words ideally lead to thoughts and actions. And much like what Cole said, it's like it's one thing to speak positively, but there has to be a certain level of consciousness to reach a certain level, and then that being followed by some form of legislative action to actually codify these things to make sure that we go forward, vice backwards. But I certainly think it matters, because when you think about it, the words that get imprinted in the minds of younger generations, that's how they're going to shape and develop their ideas about what they see around them. And you have to identify things accurately and for what they are, if you want to ever have a chance to actually address those problems in a meaningful way.
Thank you. Another question, somebody, Ruby Hartley, have asked, what are your thoughts on the role of the media in shaping people's view of ethnicity, and how can language and reporting change those perceptions? Perhaps one thing to frame that question is considering the way Black Lives Matter movement was described as riots, while Trump supporters storming the Capitol were named as protests, or at least early on in reporting. Cole, your thoughts?
Yeah, that's an issue that's gotten a lot of attention lately. I think that there's a couple of questions there. The question around the role of the media, not necessarily just in our relations with race, but also just sort of in our democracy, I think is a question that America's really struggling with at the moment. I think that I don't know that this is a great insight, though, to say that like a lot of our polarization can be directly attributed to the fact that we don't have a shared basis of fact, that not everybody is tuning in to the CBS Evening News, and that as a result, you can have totally skewed perceptions of what America is. So I think that the role of the media writ large in democracy is one that needs to be, and even like who the media is, whether Twitter and Breitbart are equally sort of entitled to that term, is a question that I think we'll be struggling with in the years to come. The role of the media in our understanding of race, I think, is similarly incredibly important. But I actually think that its role can be twofold. I mean, I grew up in a time when I think a lot of content that was generated was, and now I'm not just talking about the news, but film and TV and music, had a slim definition of Blackness, had a very sort of a stereotype definition of Blackness. I think that had a damaging effect on racial relations. I think that it caused people to have certain preconceived notions. I think that we've seen almost a swing in the other direction, particularly during the Obama years. I think that you saw Black people be given a lot of power in the media space to reshape our own narratives. Not that we're all the way there, but that we've made significant strides, and you're seeing content that depicts us in different and varied ways and important ways. So I think that it can cut both ways, I guess, is the point. Finally, to the question about sort of how the protests were covered differently. I'm actually not sure I agree with that characterization that the Trump storming of the Capitol was protests and the Black Lives Matter were riots. I actually interestingly think that, particularly if you're watching MSNBC or CNN or something, you see people say that a lot, but I'm not sure everyone, like, I don't know who they're talking about when they say like they are the news and they're saying, why are we saying this kind of thing? I think that people, the consensus view, at least in mainstream media, around the Trumpsters storming the Capitol was that it was unacceptable and a riot. That said, I certainly know, sort of in past circumstances, that BLM has overwhelmingly been covered in a way that was negative. Something like, I think the protests were like 95% peaceful or something, and something like 58% of the news coverage was on, the windows that were broken. So I think that that's unfair and dishonest, but a result of a media establishment that makes its dollars off of broken windows much more so than peace. That again goes back to the first question, that sort of, I think we need to work a lot of that out in the years to come. That was long-winded, but thank you for indulging.
No, again, long-winded responses, ramblings, like, they're very, very welcome. Trevor?
Yes, I think to start with, the comment about the social media, how it portrays, BLM differently than, say, Trump protests, activities, what have you. It's a very key point that Cole hit on. I think, one of the probably largest issues that's facing U.S. citizens these days is this perception gap in receiving information in these echo chambers. When I was a kid, you could, everyone watched TV, on basically ATV, and you could have a different perspective about what you saw, but everyone at least started off with the same, at least baseline objective piece of information. Nowadays, if I see a large media event, I'll pull up CNN, I'll pull up Fox News. They're not even talking about the same thing. Or if they're talking about the same thing, they're talking about such a different way, you wouldn't even realize they're talking about the same thing. And I think that's particularly problematic when we, as a country, don't even see the same things necessarily the same way. That's not bad, but we're not even talking about the same way. We can't even come to a consensus. We can't agree if the glass is half empty or agree if the glass is half full, because some people aren't even seeing a glass at all. It's just something entirely different. And once we start to again get honest information out there, perspective is fine. We have a large, diverse country in the U.S. Perspective is fine. We should share those perspectives, but we need to start to be able to at least see objective facts again, and we need to start being able to speak to each other again. That's another saddening thing to see is when I was, much younger, if there was a political disagreement, there was still generally a tendency to try to find the common ground and work towards it. Whereas now, if you say one thing that's out of line, you're automatically an enemy of, wherever you come from. It's worse than sports teams where, as soon as they see you starting to identify a certain way, they just don't want to be bothered with anymore. Like if you look at, what happened to Liz Cheney recently, she comes from a long lineage of, staunch conservative values, politicians. Her father, vice president, famously Secretary of Defense. And because she thought the riots were out of hand, which anyone that objectively understands democracy would agree the riots were out of hand, she was almost censured and lost her leadership position for basically speaking, her opinion and what I think many would agree was the truth about, the activities on the 6th of January. So yeah, it is unfortunate. And that's something that our country certainly could benefit from and heal from if we all just start to learn to talk together. But first, we have to learn to start to see at least the same baseline, see and receive the same baseline information. And I probably talked way too long at that point, so I will move along. I yield my time back to the center.
No, you're definitely all good. Got another question. This is from Jacob Lechner. What message would you give to young people, those in high school, university age, around the world who want to take action against racism and discrimination? What means are at their disposal?
Yeah.
Another tough one.
Yeah.
Well,
you go ahead. Well, I'll think.
Oh, no worries. Well, one thing that is very heartening to see now that you didn't necessarily see since maybe even the 60s is there's less complicity. When someone sees something wrong, it's not just a certain small minority demographic saying that thing is wrong. You know, when you look at the BLM marches, you know, whether they be in the US or globally, you're not just looking at, you know, a sea of, you know, Black people or African Americans. You're seeing Asians, you're seeing, you know, Caucasians, you're seeing, you know, heterosexuals, you're seeing homosexuals, you're seeing a large, diverse group of folks. And I think that that's one of the things, like once the awareness hits a certain critical mass, you know, that's where a lot of being able to stop these negative mindsets and stereotypes begins, because you know now people are no longer complicit, you know, to allow these negative behaviors to persist. So one easy thing is to just, you know, the golden rule: treat people as if you want to be treated. Don't see someone and just assume they're a certain way because they look, you know, a certain way. You know, kind of going to the other question, it's like I've had people approach me in all kinds of ridiculous manners because that's just the only thing they saw of Black people on TV, or that's the only way they heard them talk on a radio. And it's like, no, if you want to greet me, you could just say hello. You don't have to try to do any number of these, you know, unnatural rituals that you think I do to just say hello, or you know that bleeds into any number of things. So yeah, just treat people, you know, again, case by case basis. You know, there are a lot of great people out there, some maybe not so great. That keeps you employed too. But you know, treat people on a case by case basis. You know, and then just don't be complicit when you see those wrong behaviors. And with that awareness and that behavior, you know, we can eventually start to more, we can start to root out these behaviors long term.
Thank you.
So I think that my education in race, besides just being a Black person and sort of having a family's worth of lessons to be handed down, was also largely through books. I mean, there's a long list of, there's a deep sort of Black literary canon. One can find the list that popped up all over the internet in the wake of the George Floyd murder. So if you want to be sort of deeply acquainted with the Black experience in America, those narratives are certainly out there. You don't have to search far. But I would also, anyone that asks that question, I think I would ask the question, this is a bit blunt, but almost like, why do you care? And what I mean by that is that I too was inspired by the protests that popped up all over the world in the wake of George Floyd's murder. But I was also acutely aware of the fact that many of those countries likely had their own issues with their own oppressed peoples. I think that America has outsized cultural power in the world, and therefore when one of us falls deeply unjustly, you know, people around the world care. I think that that's important. I was encouraged to see that. But I also thought to myself, surely there are oppressed people closer to home that you should be caring about, or could be caring about instead. So I think that if one cares to learn about the Black American experience, one should, but certainly not instead of the person in your own backyard who has likely a very similar experience. Obviously, the closest, I think it's often sort of posed to me in questions as though the Indigenous experience here is identical to the Black American experience in the U.S. I think that is false. But but the closest parallel, obviously, here would be the Indigenous experience. I think anyone that chooses to spend time acquainting themselves with the Black American experience instead of the Indigenous one should ask themselves why.
Thank you. I got a person who's wanting to ask a question. Donald Maynard, I'll just unmute you if you want to ask your question.
Okay, hey, thanks, Calvin, and oh God, I probably have a funny little picture up there. Thanks, Calvin and Cole and Trevor. I come from a city in the United States that in the 1960s, when crosstown busing first started, decided that they would close their schools for an entire year rather than admit African-American students into the schools where the white kids went. And I later went to private school where we had sort of one black kid in each year, and then transferred to public school for high school. And where I had a much richer experience, where I think in my home city, and Trevor, you know the city, Norfolk, Virginia, where I think 50–60% of our student body was African American, and I really feel I gained from that experience. Can you guys think of any other areas in the United States where we can break down what you referred to earlier as those red lines, and break down some of those boundaries so that we can learn from what we've learned with busing and integration of our schools to try to get more integration and more shared experience? Thanks.
I can take a stab at it. I think that busing is an interesting example. I think that sort of depending on who you ask about busing, you might get 10 different answers about whether or not it was a success. There certainly has been resegregation of schooling systems in the time since busing. So whether or not you claim it as a success, you certainly could see today that whatever successes were won sort of didn't translate decades into the future. So that's one place I think that we could do, you know, segregation of schooling systems, I think is a problem. One interesting thing about busing, when people try to analyze whether or not it was successful, is that the pupils were diversified, but the teachers were not. There's longstanding research that the outcomes of Black pupils, Black men in particular, are profoundly impacted by having a Black teacher at some